Well, good morning, everyone. So, in the church, when we talk about, see if I can get my thing to work for me here. There we go. When we talk about sexuality and intimacy, we most often will talk about the sinful side of things, the sin of sexual morality, the dangers of lust. And those are legitimate things. We must talk about those dangers. But because we tend to focus so much on the sinful side of things, we seldom teach about godly intimacy in the church. We tend to try to just toss a blanket statement over it saying, hey, be intimate with your spouse, and then we move on. And I understand why that is. After all, it is awkward to talk about sexuality and intimacy. It's uncomfortable. And we see this and we get a little bit, nervous. What's he going to say? We don't want to corrupt the innocent. We don't want to introduce ideas to the youngsters that they're not ready for. And that's also very legitimate. But also, I think it's often misunderstood because many people's only education in intimacy is from the world, is from sin. There is a misguided thought that intimacy is only about pleasure. And they feel uncomfortable talking about a subject that's both about pleasure in the church. But as I said, that's a misunderstanding of the subject. So the fact of the matter is that because it goes untaught, people go unprepared. And that's a danger with any subject, that people go unprepared. And we could point out many, many instances where people are not taught about godly intimacy. And so maybe their only training on intimacy is from pornography, and they end up abusing their spouse or doing things that are degrading or harmful to their spouse. Or maybe they've only been taught about the sin of sexual immorality, and so when they get into their marriage, their intimacy is blocked because they feel that it's dirty even in marriage, and the marriage suffers. And so when people go untaught, they go unprepared. So today, as we're finishing our sermon series about possessing your vessel in sanctification, yes, this is the last of the awkward ones for a little while. Next week we'll be getting into Habakkuk and talking about dealing with trials in the world. But today, to wrap up this sermon series, we are going to be talking about God-approved intimacy. Because there is intimacy that God approves of. And we, as God's people, need to understand that. To do this today, we will be looking at Song of Solomon, which Song of Solomon isn't taught on very often because, again, it's a love poem. It deals very exclusively with intimacy. So we don't touch on it all that often. But Song of Solomon gives us a beautiful look at godly, righteous intimacy in a marriage. Now, to do this today, we're first going to see that godly intimacy builds your spouse up. Then we're going to see that godly intimacy motivates us to address potential problems. Thirdly, we're going to see that godly intimacy prioritizes mutual satisfaction. And finally, we're going to see that godly intimacy motivates reconciliation. Now, as we go through this, we're going to see that we must keep intimacy in its God-approved bounds. We're also going to see that we should use intimacy in our marriages to strengthen our relationships. And when we do that, our marriages can be strong. Now, I do have a couple of caveats for us before we jump into things. One being that I am going to keep everything appropriate. I am not going to be getting lewd or rude or overly detailed with anything. I don't, again, want to corrupt the youngsters. I also need us to all be on the same page that sexual intimacy is exclusively for within the marriage. It must not be expressed outside of marriage. It must not be explored outside of marriage. So what we're talking about as we talk about intimacy is exclusively for within the marriage. Now, thirdly, if you're sitting there and you're saying, well, I'm not married, or I'm, not married yet, or I'm not going to be married again, or things like that. While most of the sermon isn't for you, there are elements that are going to be useful for you because you can help your married friends by not corrupting their marriages. You have to know what to avoid so that you don't accidentally or intentionally cause a problem for somebody else's marriage. So, with these things having been said, let's dig into it and see that godly intimacy builds your spouse up. Now, this is one of those topics that I would love to say was just so obvious we don't even have to talk about it. But too often, people end up cutting their spouse down. They end up bringing emotional pain to their spouse. And that is not godly intimacy. So let's go to Song of Solomon 1, starting in verse 5. And as we get into this, the way that Song of Solomon is structured is it gives different speeches. The groom will speak, then the bride will speak, and then there's also sometimes a chorus that will speak. And so I'll try to highlight who's talking at any given time. So we're going to read the bride speaking here, verses 5 through 7. And she says, I am black but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not stare at me because I'm swarthy, for the sun has burned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me caretaker of the vineyards, but I have not taken care of my own vineyard. Tell me, O you whom my soul loves, where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? Now, it seems that the bride is expressing some insecurities here. She's saying, don't look at me. Why should I be someone who is seen? And it is extremely common for one or both parties in a relationship to harbor insecurities, to feel that they're not good enough, whether they are insecurities about their body or insecurities about their character or just in general shyness. This is very common. So the question becomes, how should the other member respond? Now, again, I would love to say that this is just blatantly obvious. But too often, people might respond by ignoring those. Is that a healthy way to deal with your spouse's insecurities? Just ignore them and hope they go away? Or maybe ridicule them. Does that help overcome insecurities? Or maybe invalidate them. Tell them that you're not actually worried about that. These are things that are far too common. So let's see what the groom does. How does the groom handle his bride's insecurity? Well, the groom verbally builds up his bride. Read with me, verses 8 through 11. He says, if you yourself do not know, most beautiful among women, go forth on the trail of the flock and pasture your goats by the tents of the shepherds. To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of beads. We will make for you ornaments of gold with beads of silver. So he verbally builds up his bride. And he does this in a really neat way. First off, he uses word pictures to illustrate his affection. Now, a word picture is when you don't just tell someone something, but you build an image for them with your words to express the emotional impact. And here he says, in verse 9, to me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Now, that word picture may be lost on us because we're like a horse. What? But you think about Solomon being a king. He's going to have the choice among all the different horses in the land. He's going to choose and build a relationship with the best horse around. And it's going to be a close relationship. And it's going to be better than any of those other, chariots around. And that idea that you're like my mare. You are close to me. I chose you among all the other ones that I could have chosen. You're special. That illustrates how much he loves her. He also highlights aspects of her that he admires. He talks about her jewelry and her looks. She's expressing these insecurities. And he is doing his best to build her up, to show her that while, yes, she may be insecure, she doesn't need to be insecure. And that's a great lesson for us. When our spouse expresses insecurities, rather than putting them down or ridiculing them or invalidating them, we need to build them up. In the next few verses, verses 12 through 17, each one then continues to verbally build up the other one. We read, the bride responds by saying, "While the king was at his table, my perfume gave forth its fragrance. My beloved is to me a pouch of myrrh which lies at night in between my breasts. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of En-gedi." And then he responds, "How beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves." And she says, "How handsome you are, my beloved, and so pleasant. Indeed, our couch is luxuriant. The beams of our house are of cedar. Our rafters are cypress." So in this, they're not just saying nice things to each other, but they're building each other up through word pictures again. She builds a word picture here that he is like the perfume pouch that is close to her heart. She keeps him close to her. That's a beautiful picture. And they also use admiration. But you notice they're going beyond simply saying, "Hey, you look pretty slick." They express in detail to each other what they admire. And they also use dream building. At this point in the Song of Solomon, they're still courting. The marriage ceremony doesn't take place till the end of chapter 3. And so she's dream building with him, talking about the beams of their house. Well, they're not yet married yet. It's not yet their house. It's still his house. But that dream building can help us grow closer to our spouse by looking at the future and saying, "This is the future I envision with you together." All of these things build up our spouse. See, the way we use our words plays a critical role in godly intimacy. One negative comment or cutting remark can undo all the good, all the praise that you can give. And this parallels very beautifully what is said in Ephesians 5:22 through 33. Ephesians 5:22 through 33 is one of the passages we often look at when we talk about relations between a husband and a wife. It says, starting in verse 22, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything." And then he speaks to the husbands. He says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church, and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself." Now Paul goes on and he talks about this more, but then he wraps everything up in verse 33, where he says, "Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband." Paul uses relatively clinical terms here. Love your spouse, love your wife as Christ loved the church, love your wife as you love your own body. Wives, respect your husbands. Well, the way we use our speech plays into this. We build up our spouse by praising them, by showing them our affection verbally. We can show them love. We can show them respect. Where if we cut them down, if we use abusive speech, that's not showing the love of Christ, and that's not showing respect. See, the way we use our words plays a critical role in a healthy marriage. So we need to watch the way we use our words. So now let's go back to the Song of Solomon, and we'll see the next section of our sermon, that is that godly intimacy motivates us to address potential problems. And at this point, we're talking about potential problems. Things that haven't yet become a problem, but they could be. Let's read Song of Solomon 2:14 through 17. Solomon says, O my dove, in the cleft of the rock, in the secret place of the steep pathways, let me see your form, let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet and your form is lovely. So the groom here, he desires intimacy. He wants to spend time with her. However, look at how she responds. She says, catch the foxes for us. The little foxes that are running in the vineyards while our vineyards are in blossom. Okay, foxes? Why are we suddenly talking about garden? Why are we talking about small animals? This seems like a complete left turn. Well, to understand this, we need to understand the word pictures being used. So, what do foxes do? Well, they're not just cute little animals we put in emojis. Foxes are actually omnivorous. They eat small animals, but they also eat plants. They'll eat vegetables, they'll eat fruit, they'll eat roots, they'll eat basically anything. And so if a fox gets into a garden, it will eat any of the plants, any of the produce. It'll also dig up the plants, and it will burrow. On top of that, a fox, the way that they mark out their territory is with feces. So a garden that is infested with foxes, the produce is going to be ruined, the plants are going to be dug up, there's going to be burrows, and it's going to turn nasty. So these foxes, they represent things that cause problems in a relationship. And so she's basically saying, okay, Solomon, there's something that's causing an issue. There's something that's causing friction. And it may not be a big problem yet, but it could become a problem. For the relationship to be healthy, those things must be addressed. And we have these things in our relationships too. You know, there's plenty of examples of things that may even seem cute at the beginning. Maybe the way that a person communicates. Maybe rather than directly addressing issues, they avoid conflict and they just try to push things under the rug. And that may not seem like a big deal, but eventually it causes big problems. Or maybe somebody in the relationship has a slightly biting form of joking. And at first it seems somewhat cute, but then that slightly biting form of joking turns into verbal abuse. So we see how those little foxes, if they're not caught, they'll cause problems. So the bride here says, okay, there's some sort of little problem we need to address, we need to fix. But then notice what she does. She says, my beloved is mine, and I am his. He pastures his flocks among the lilies until the cool of the day when the shadows flee away. Turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mountains of Beth-er. So, though there are foxes to be caught, the bride reaffirms her admiration for the groom. She reaffirms that she admires him. And this is an important part of bringing up issues in our marriages. Okay, there's a little problem. There's something that could cause an issue. But we need to reaffirm that this isn't a deal breaker. This isn't something that makes me hate you. We just need to work through it. When we bring up those issues, we must reaffirm our admiration and our love so that we can work through the issue. See, the desire for intimacy motivates us to address those potential problems. Okay, you want to be intimate with your spouse, you want to have intimacy, you need to fix these problems so that there's not that friction, there's not that hindrance. And again, this reflects us back to Ephesians 5:22-23, where he said in verse 33, nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own spouse, or love his own wife even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. Part of love and respect is dealing with those little foxes, dealing with those little things that cause friction in a relationship. If we ignore those foxes, well, that's not loving your bride as Christ loved the church. If we ignore those foxes, that's not showing respect to the husband. So the way that we address potential problems plays a critical role in a healthy marriage. And there are going to be potential problems. But now as we move into the text, this brings us to another aspect of godly intimacy, and that is that godly intimacy prioritizes mutual satisfaction. And I want us to pay attention to that word prioritizes. Our priorities are what we're going to spend time on. And unfortunately, people are often selfish and unaware of the other's needs. They often prioritize themselves and their own satisfaction rather than their spouses. And because of this, physical intimacy may sometimes only be satisfying to one spouse. Now, real talk for a minute. Studies have shown, and when you read marriage counseling books, very often what happens is men are clueless and we don't understand the needs of our wife. And so we think that the wife needs the same things we do, which our needs are very, very simple. And because of that, many, many women express dissatisfaction with the intimacy with their husband because they don't get any enjoyment out of it, or it may even be painful. And so we need to understand our spouse. You see, it doesn't have to be that only one party gets satisfaction. Turn with me, Song of Solomon 4, 1 through 15. And we see the groom takes time to connect with her emotionally. He says, "How beautiful you are." This is after the wedding feast that happened in chapter 3. "How beautiful you are, my darling. How beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats that have descended from Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of newly shorn ewes, which have come up from their washing, all of which bear twins, and not one among them has lost her young. Your lips are like a scarlet thread. Your mouth is lovely. Your temples are like a slice of pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with rows of stones, on which are hung 1,000 shields, all the round shields of the mighty men. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle, which feed among the lilies. Until the cool of the day, when the shadow flees away, I will go my way to the mountains of myrrh and to the hills of frankincense." We see in this that he's taking time to connect with her emotionally. He appreciates her body verbally. And this is where guys are sometimes kind of clueless. We just think that our admiration of our wife is going to be understood, right? Because we're here. But taking that time to verbally appreciate her helps to connect with her emotionally. He goes on, he says, "You are altogether beautiful, my darling, and there's no blemish in you. Come with me from Lebanon, my bride. May you come with me from Lebanon. Journey down from the summit of Amana, from the summit of Senir and Hermon, from the dens of lions, from the mountains of leopards. You have made my heart beat faster, my sister, my bride. You have made my heart beat faster with a single glance of your eyes, with a single strand of your necklace. How beautiful is your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrances of your oil than all kinds of spices." And he goes on in this vein. We see in this that he communicates his appreciation for her company. How much he enjoys spending time with her. Again, he communicates it to her clearly and, of course, in some flowery speech here because this is a poem. But he's taking that time to engage with her, to connect with her. Because quite frankly, women need more time than men. Now, how does she respond? In verse 16, we see her response. "Awake, O north wind, and come, wind of the south. Make my garden breathe out fragrances. Let its spices be wafted abroad. May my beloved come into his garden and eat of his choice fruits." We see here the bride responds with an invitation and makes herself available to him. Like I said, guys' needs are relatively easy. She makes herself available to him. She offers that invitation. We see in this that both parties are prioritizing their spouse. And when both parties are prioritizing the other, neither one is neglected. Now, we're going to move forward to chapter 6, because in chapter 6 we see a few more really important details. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, the bride communicates her admiration for the groom to others. Read this. "Where has your beloved gone?" This is the chorus speaking. "Where has your beloved gone, O most beautiful among women? Where has your beloved turned, that we may seek him with you?" She says, "My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of balsam, to pasture his flocks in the garden and gather lilies. I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine, he who pastures his flocks among the lilies. We see throughout this book that she speaks to others in a positive fashion. See, there's this bad habit that both men and women get into where they will spouse bash. You've heard it. Men get together and say, oh, you won't believe what my wife did. Oh, well, I can top that. You won't believe what my wife did. And women do the same thing. You won't believe what my husband did. And someone else says, well, I can top that. You can't believe what my husband did. And they cut down their spouse. Now what happens when that's going on? The spouse's self-esteem is going to go to the depths of low. It's going to ruin their self-esteem. But when you see your spouse talk positively to others, that builds you up, right? That makes you appreciative of them. And then, in the next section, the groom expresses the emotional effect she has on him. This is one of my favorite sections in Song of Solomon. He says, you are as beautiful as Tirzah, my darling, as lovely as Jerusalem, as awesome as an army with banners. And then watch this what he says in verse 5. Turn your eyes away from me, for they have confused me. Your hair is like a flock of goats that have descended from Gilead. I don't know about you guys, but that really connects with me. Especially when I was dating Keely. Man, she'd look at me and my brain would go blank. Turn your eyes away from me. They confuse me. What were we talking about? He's expressing to her that she has this emotional effect on him. And that makes a big impact. You know, us guys, we tend to want to be stoic and be like, nothing can affect me emotionally. But that's not what a woman needs. A woman needs somebody who will communicate his emotions to her. And that's what the groom does here. See, this positive communication, this admiration, this availability, and it all promotes mutual satisfaction. It promotes both parties in the marriage getting the most that they can out of those interactions. And this illustrates very well what is said in 1 Peter 3:7. 1 Peter 3:7. Now, starting in verse 1, he talks to both parties. He talks first to the wives. But then I want to read what he says in verse 7 because I think it plays a big role in what we're talking about at the moment. He says, you husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Okay, guys, our wives have different needs than we do. We may not understand those needs, but we must. It is a God-given command that we must strive to understand their needs so that we can have the best relationship with them possible. Now, I'm speaking specifically to the men because generally this is a problem that men have, where we don't take the time to understand our spouse's needs. So guys, take the time to live with your wife in an understanding way. Notice, so that your prayers will not be hindered. This doesn't just impact your marriage, this impacts your relationship with God. See, what we prioritize plays a critical role in a healthy marriage. Do we prioritize our spouse and their needs? Or are we selfish in prioritizing ourselves? Because prioritizing self is the path to ruin. Now we come to the final section we're going to talk about today, and that is that godly intimacy motivates reconciliation. We talked earlier about addressing potential problems, but you know, sometimes a conflict arises and the potential problem is no longer a potential, it is an actual, and you have a conflict of some kind. Chapters 5 and 6 give a pattern of what happened during a conflict in their marriage and how it was resolved. Let's look at the conflict first. Chapter 5, verse 1, we see that he was out late. He says, I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I have gathered my myrrh along with my balsam. I have eaten my honeycomb and my honey. I have drunk my wine and my milk. Eat, friends, drink, and imbibe deeply, O lovers. It appears that he was probably having a late party with maybe some dignitaries or something. We don't know all the details, but by her response in the next verse, she wasn't happy about it. So he's out late, and she went to bed upset. Verse 2, I was asleep, but my heart was awake. A voice, my beloved, was knocking. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is drenched with dew, my loss for the damp of the night. So she's asleep, but her heart was awake. You ever had that situation where you go to bed upset, and you may be sort of sleeping, but you're not at peace. Your heart is awake. And then he comes home. He comes home, and he wants her attention. Okay, look at how she responds. She refuses him. Verse 3, I have taken off my dress. How can I put it on again? I have washed my feet. How can I dirty them again? She's saying, no, I'm not going to come spend time with you. I already went to bed. You were out late. No. And so, verses 4 through 6, he leaves. She says, my beloved extended his hand through the opening, and my feelings were aroused for him. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, and my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the bolts. I opened to my beloved, and my beloved had turned away and had gone. My heart went out to him as he spoke. I searched for him, but I did not find him. I called to him, but he did not answer. So, what exactly happens here? There's a little bit of a interpretation difference depending on which commentaries you read. Either he literally physically left and she went to go find him but couldn't find him, or he disconnected emotionally. He's emotionally left even though he may be still in the room. And she tries to find him, tries to connect with him, but he's gone. The plain fact of the matter is that in marriage, conflicts will happen. And conflicts hinder intimacy. No matter how idealistic a young couple is, no matter how perfect their beginning, there will be conflict. That's what happens when you have two human beings living in close proximity. So we need to know how to handle these conflicts. And what comes in the next section isn't necessarily a universal step-by-step, but it gives us some good principles for helping us work through conflicts. So let's see how the whole thing is resolved. And in the text, it's the bride going and trying to make things better, but the steps that we're going to look at could apply equally to a husband or a wife taking these steps. So first off, she feels hurt, but she looks for him. Let's read 6 through 8. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned away and had gone. My heart went out to him as he spoke. I searched for him, but I did not find him. I called to him, but he did not answer me. The watchmen who make the rounds in the city found me. They struck me and wounded me. The guardsmen on the wall took away my shawl from me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, as to what you will tell him, for I am lovesick. So she feels hurt, but she still goes to try to find him. Now, what goes on in verse 7 most likely is not literal. She's the queen. If the literal guardsmen literally struck her, they would be literally killed. So that's probably figurative. Now, some commentators have put forth that that is her beating herself up internally, that her emotions are getting the best of her, and she is berating herself and making herself feel bad about the way that she reacted. Others have put forth that maybe since he disconnected emotionally, they say, that maybe he's speaking harshly to her. And while he should be caring for her emotions, he actually verbally is harsh with her. And she feels hurt about it. Either way, she's hurt, but she still goes and she looks for him. And this is an important step in dealing with conflict in our marriages, is that sometimes we may feel hurt. Our spouse might have done something that insulted us or hurt our feelings, but it's important for us to go ahead and take the initiative to try to fix things, to try to connect with them, to try to make it right. We then see in verses 8 and 9 that she seeks help. She says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, as to what you will tell him, for I am lovesick. And the others respond, what kind of beloved is your beloved, O most beautiful among women? What kind of beloved is your beloved, that thus you adjure us? There is no shame in seeking help. Sometimes a conflict in a marriage can get to the point that you need outside help, whether it be marriage counseling or whether it be the wisdom of somebody who's older who can help you mediate the issue. There's no shame in seeking help. We then see in verses 10 through 16 that she remembers what she admires about him. And we're not going to read through this in detail, but she remembers what it is that she loves about him. This is another important step of resolving conflict. Thinking about the positive. If we spend all of our time thinking about the negative, thinking about the way that we were hurt, then we produce a negative spiral. But if we intentionally decide, okay, I'm going to think about the things that I appreciate about my spouse. I'm going to think about the reason why I'm with this person in the first place. That can help us to treat them in a positive fashion to overcome the conflict. And then in chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, he reaffirms his love for her. We read that section already. But he reaffirms that he still loves her. And that's important when there's been a conflict and the resolution is worked through and we come back together. It's important for both parties to reaffirm their love that, yes, we had a conflict. Yes, things were tough, but I still love you. And I still appreciate you. And I still want to make this work. You see, godly intimacy is great motivation for reconciliation. Now, why do I say intimacy is a great motivation? Not just that it's important. Well, the answer is found multiple places in the Bible, but we're going to go to Hebrews 13:4. Hebrews 13:4 says, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge. The Bible very clearly tells us that any sexual intimacy outside of marriage is sin. Fornicators and adulterers God will judge. That means that if we want to have physical intimacy in this life, we must make it work with our spouse. That's one of the many reasons why God set up the rules about marriage, divorce, and remarriage like he did. Because he wants us to learn to work it out. And so if we want to have intimacy with our spouse, we will humble ourselves and go through what it takes to make it work with our spouse, even though sometimes there's conflicts. We see in this that the way we handle conflict plays a crucial role in a healthy marriage. So today, as we are coming to a close on our sermon, and we've been talking about God-approved intimacy, we've seen that godly intimacy builds up your spouse. It does not cut your spouse down. It does not insult the spouse, but it builds the spouse up. We've seen that godly intimacy motivates us to address potential problems, to catch those foxes. We've seen that godly intimacy prioritizes mutual satisfaction, prioritizing the other above self. And we've seen that godly intimacy motivates reconciliation. But we need to fix things when there's a conflict. So my friends, by way of application today, went too far. Keep physical intimacy within its proper bounds. That is, within the bonds of marriage. We must not go outside those bounds, and we must keep the marriage undefiled. With that in mind, use physical intimacy to strengthen your marriage. When used in a godly fashion, godly intimacy is an amazing, healthy aspect of a godly marriage. Not the only aspect, but it is a large aspect of it. And it is for far more than simply pleasure. It is a great tool for strength. So, today, if you have a need, maybe there's something in your marriage that you need the help of the elders with, maybe there's some other need in your life that you need the congregation's prayers about, the invitation is for you. When we have our invitation, feel free to come up to the front. One of our elders will come speak with you. And if you want to learn more about salvation, maybe you're watching online and you can't necessarily come sit up front, but you can contact us through email or Facebook message or phone call, we encourage you, get in contact with us. We would love to teach you about the Bible. We would love to teach you about salvation. So if you have a need, whatever your need may be, please let it be known as we're led in our invitation.